10 years on, Chile's military dictatorship is still in control, but the human cost is rising. For the first time, people question if General Pinochet will see another anniversary. Chile's national stadium stands an empty reminder to the coup 10 years ago, which overthrew Chile's last democratically elected president, Salvador Allende. Thousands of intellectuals, students, politicians were incarcerated and tortured here. No one knows how many of them died. Diplomats at the time estimated 4,000. Under the cantilevered stands of the stadium, tens of thousands of unemployed Chileans now queue to sign on to the register for the junta's latest scheme to provide a minimal income in return for long hours on public works. The authorities say 25% of the workforce is jobless. Church sources reckon 50%. The junta's program gives them just £16 a month for often fruitless labor. It was soon after the coup that the military invited Milton Friedman and the Chicago School of Monetarist Economic Theory to run Chile's economy. A free market boom brought new buildings and a flood of imports. Today, the escalators ride to nowhere, the buildings are empty and the crash is complete. Lost Chicago boys, as Chileans describe them, blame the world recession. Though the middle classes have suffered, hundreds of thousands of Chileans who dwell in the shanty towns have suffered more, and in suffering blame the military dictatorship. The symbol of the Copper Workers Union does not exaggerate. Chile is dependent upon her copper exports. The copper workers sowed the seeds of protest here, led by their new president, Rodolfo Seguel. And though their protest strike failed and he was jailed, the seed took root, so that today they demonstrate, though harassed by the military who have prevented such things until now. But their protest kindled more violent action in the shanty towns. Human rights workers blame rightist paramilitary groups for sparking the violence, but in truth, many shanty dwellers now appear to feel they have nothing more to lose, no jobs, no future. They are no longer intimidated by the repression which contained them until the economic crisis became so total. Though assassins have struck too, killing Santiago's military governor and bodyguards last week. Some say it was leftists warning General Pinochet, others that it was rightists gunning down a soft-line military man as a warning not to give in to the protests, and General Pinochet himself still saying no democracy before 1989. Yet on the other hand, two sets of nocturnal talks have taken place between a suddenly appointed civilian interior minister and banned political leaders like Gabriel Valdez, recently jailed by General Pinochet.
He has shown a willingness to start slowly a process of democratization, but inside the constitution, inside the structure of the regime. We said we don't accept this structure. We have to go together, if they want to go with good faith, back to the people, to have a plebiscite, an election, to elect representatives to organize and to discuss a new constitution. This is our proposal.
But the dialogue, as it's called, hasn't taken the steam out of the protests. Even the school children are now brazenly shouting for Pinochet to go. For now, the military are holding firm behind him, exerting force on his behalf even against these teenagers. In a downtown Santiago office, the Human Rights Commission here says, in the words of its international secretary, Gonzalo Taborga, that a new wave of repression has set in. New evidence of torture is coming to light every day. The Copper Workers Union has displayed recent torture marks on their members who've suffered during detention as a result of the protests. The Human Rights Commission says the military's aim remains to maintain its hold. But still the protest is gathering momentum, a momentum that is hard to see the authorities quelling. The Americans, who through the CIA worked to bring down the last democracy, are keeping a low profile. The British have backed Europe's condemnation of the repression here, but the British government, still close to the Chilean military in the aftermath of the services rendered during the Falklands War, is supplying the regime with arms. In the meantime, the police are out on the streets trying to contain the protests. Few believe, however, that even the regular usage of the water cannons will dampen the protesters' ultimate ambition for a return to democracy. Jon Snow, ITN, Santiago. It started at the medical school, young doctors writing democracy, students chanting, "He's going to fall." His paramilitary police waiting opposite to underline General Pinochet's belief that he won't, and he himself, still cheered by some, on a balcony as if no threat existed, confident he can defy the demand for democracy. He'd sent the water cannon out to the main square to try to prevent a planned peaceful protest against his dictatorship. But still new waves of demonstrators poured into the center of the city to join a protest which 10 years of repression have prevented until now. By now, it had become a pitched battle between police and demonstrators. Eventually, even if only briefly, driving the police back. For days before this demonstration, the protesters, the main political leaders, even though they're banned in this country, pleaded for a peaceful demonstration. But it is the action of the police themselves that has ensured that it has turned to violence. It was amid the continuing gas attack that the leader of the copper workers who started the original protest last May appeared to beg for 10 minutes of peaceful assembly. For a moment, he walked out triumphant. But immediately the water cannon were back, wiping out the last chance to avoid an escalation of the violence. Of the thousands who'd assembled here, more than 600 were arrested. Many were badly beaten. By night, all over Santiago, residents set burning barricades to keep the military out. For it is in the hours of darkness that the killing occurs. Troops firing at random into people's homes killed over 30 on the last day of protest. And in the middle-class areas, the only other demonstration they can get away with, the whole city ringing to the clatter of saucepan lids. Even street signs served as a soundboard for protest. Few believe it is yet enough to break the dictatorship, but events in Chile after 10 years of repression are beginning to move fast. Jon Snow, News at 1, Santiago. European embassies, including the British, boycotted this morning's celebrations here to underline their concern at the latest phase of repression. General Pinochet's 10 years have left a trail of tens of thousands of internal and external exiles and what Amnesty International describes as a record of systematized torture. A parade to celebrate a decade of his dictatorship required financial inducements to produce an adequate turnout. In the outlying shantytowns, they marked the anniversary with a funeral for one of a dozen people shot dead by police here over the past 2 days. 22-year-old Miguel Zavala had been killed by one of the many rounds of police bullets fired at random into shanty houses during the hours of darkness. Sudden running at the cemetery signaled the arrival of the police. Armored personnel carriers encircled the protesters, and stones began to fly. For the fourth day in succession, the police unleashed hundreds of rounds of acrid tear gas. Protesters dragged from the graveside were beaten, but the police were firing live rounds too. This man shot in the back, 2 others shot dead. More guns were brought up as reinforcements against the unarmed people. The French priest who'd conducted the funeral pleaded with his parishioners to go home, but was threatened by police when he pleaded with them to do likewise. And still they fired. Ten years on, Chile's military dictatorship is still in control, but the human cost is rising. With debts of $17 billion as well, for the first time, people question if General Pinochet will see another anniversary. Jon Snow, ITN, Santiago. A sense of Prussian pomp accompanied General Pinochet to the ceremony to celebrate his 10 years in power here. But in view of the considerable propaganda campaign his junta had run to persuade Chileans of the benefits of his rule, the response on the streets was limited. One flat dweller incidentally using the moment to dampen some of the enthusiasm that was expressed. It was in General Pinochet's speech, however, that his response to the mounting internal and external criticism of his dictatorship was summed up. Fundamentally, there will be no change. The military will remain in power as planned, at least until 1989, he said. Only a hint that there might be, sometime, a plebiscite to constitute some kind of civilian congress to operate beneath the military. The only serious attempt to get people to come out and celebrate continued military rule here occurred on Friday. Tens of thousands of people on the streets of Santiago, apparently spontaneously joyful at the dictator's presence, and some undoubtedly are. But many of those armed with government-issued Pinochet portraits were workers from the official minimum employment schemes. Half a month's wages were paid to them for coming, and the threat that they'd lose their jobs if they didn't. And though General Pinochet was the object of the exercise, the man he has called in as Interior Minister, a founding father of Chile's Nazi party in the 30s, Sergio Harper, is increasing his popularity. He has deftly outmaneuvered most of the centrist political leaders in talks that he had claimed could lead to democracy, and thereby bought time for the regime. And though even this event ended in street violence, with riot police in evidence, the army was not sent in, and the considerable fatalities that occurred during last month's protests, when they were reduced by half. Much of the beating up of opposition demonstrators was left to Pinochet-supporting youths wielding staves, with a bit of tear gas thrown in. In the shantytowns, however, it was a different story. Police trying to penetrate what is now for them almost no-go territory. Here, the people feel well outside what little political opening there has been, and virtually at war with the regime. General Pinochet's police are substantially armed, and not only with tear gas. The week has seen a succession of incidents in which they have loosed off live rounds at random at the homes of shanty dwellers. A dozen people died in these attacks over the weekend, their families comforted in grief by the only overtly organized defenders of the shanty populations, the mainly foreign Roman Catholic priests who minister here. Men like Father Pierre Dubois from France, whose shanty parish of La Victoria has been a particular focus for police action. He has detailed numerous incidents of police violence here over the past months and has himself been subjected to arrest. It was unsurprising, therefore, that the weekend's killings produced finally one of the biggest anti-Pinochet protests ever seen in the 10 years of the dictatorship. It began as a funeral procession to the cemetery, was threatened midway by a police advance. It was here that the role the priests are now playing in opposing the junta was underlined, as Father Dubois took charge, sitting the people on the roadway, lecturing them on peaceful protest. Then systematically searching many of them for the stones they yearned to unleash on waiting police. But the momentum of protest was already rolling and fast outstripping the priests' ability to control it. And when the police appeared, the stones and the pent-up frustrations flew anyway. Tear gas, rifle rounds, 2 more dead, the standard product of each of the protests here. And Father Dubois, staggering, gassed on the railway line, having divided the factions, but having failed in his attempt to control a peaceful protest by his people. Across town, in a quiet church in a Santiago suburb, Cardinal Silva Enriquez celebrated Mass. He is the figurehead for those who have battled to stem the violations of human rights by the Pinochet regime. He was not celebrating the dictator's 10th anniversary with any joy, but he is undoubtedly giving succor to Father Dubois and the other beleaguered priests in their embattled shanty parishes. General Pinochet, too, was at Mass, though none of the church hierarchy was there to celebrate it. Every European embassy boycotted the event as well. Internal and external pressure for change has therefore converged to make his 10th anniversary uncomfortable. But with the military giving every impression of unity behind him, it appears that General Pinochet is riding out the storm. Beneath the mountains in the plush outskirts of Santiago, despite the vast national debt, the general is building himself a new bunker. It remains an open question whether he'll ever live in it. It's due to be in use in time for his next anniversary, a year from now. Jon Snow, ITN, Santiago.